So hello, everyone. My name is Olka Joshi Hansen. I am Chief Program Officer at Grantmakers for Education, a member organization for education funders. I am joined today by our Executive Director, Celine Coggins, and other members of our team, as well as a great panel that we're excited about. This learning series began earlier this year in response to GFE member interests. As funders are considering issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, they're asking for opportunities to expand their own understanding of learners and community populations that their organizations might not currently be serving or may not be serving as well as they could. So we've had recent learning series events on rural communities and on Native American students, and this is the first in a series about Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. I do want to note that this program was opened up to non-member funders. So we've got a diverse group on this call. And I'd like to just introduce Kenji Treanor, who's Director of Strategy, Effectiveness, and Learning at the Stuart Foundation, who'll give us a little bit of background and introduce and moderate our panel. Thank you, Kenji.
Thanks, Olka. Hi, everybody. Really thankful that you're taking the time to join us today. Actually going to share a few comments that are also sort of a blend of personal and professional reflections, just to set a little bit of context, at least in terms of how I'm coming to the conversation today. First, feel like, of course, want to just express really profound senses of gratitude and appreciation and acknowledgement for people who came before us. And for me personally, that is, I think a lot about family, my great-grandparents who immigrated from Japan to the colonized territory of Hawaii in the early 1900s, my grandparents who were born on sugarcane plantations, both of my parents who actually went to college, but in very non-traditional paths as adults. In just a few generations there of my own family, there's a lot to acknowledge, right? The taking and settling of native land, the movement of labor across borders, the struggle for access to higher education and economic mobility. So, I'm just really grateful and thinking about all those folks who came before. And I think in the professional context, I'm mindful about that too. There have been AAPI staffers in foundations and professional associations like GFE. And these are some folks that have been helping diversify philanthropy for a long time. Many of these folks have direct experience working as advocates in communities around immigration or housing or women's rights or LGBTQ issues or language access. And in philanthropy, it's like these are the folks that help create and lead the affinity groups that we have and have been, working really thoughtfully and collaboratively for a long time to support the field moving towards, equity and diversity and inclusion. So also want to throw a quick shout out to Paul Moon, who I think is actually on the call as a participant today and is a former staff member at GFE. And Paul reached out to me actually after our foundation, the Stuart Foundation, posted a full statement that was co-written by the AAPI leaders in our organization following the Georgia shootings. And at the Stuart Foundation, we felt both a moral and a practical imperative to engage and communicate at that time. We are a California-based foundation. We have a specific interest in adolescents, both as academic learners and as whole people who are developing their sense of identity and belonging and social relationships and civic agency. So with more AAPI youth here than in any other state, we knew that they were going to be watching how institutions and those with power would react in that moment. So Paul noticed our message. He and I emailed back and forth about hoping to see more education funders become visible and vocal. And then soon thereafter, he suggested that GFE might open a learning and discussion forum focused on AAPIs, really to draw more education funders closely to this topic. So super thankful to Paul for helping launch the idea and the initial planning of this series. And I guess the only other thoughts and comments that I would share is just, really honestly, vulnerably, sort of feeling, again, this deep sense of gratitude and appreciation, and honestly, a little bit of anxiety and a little bit of anguish. At least the last 2 centuries, Asian and Pacific Islander peoples have had a difficult and tenuous relationship to the white world, and whether we were in Asia or the Pacific region or in the United States or elsewhere. Today's session, of course, is just an introduction. We're going to only barely begin to talk about the sort of rich histories and complex realities of people. And I'm super thrilled that we're having this conversation. I'm simultaneously also a little afraid, honestly, and I really appreciate GFE making this an explicit topic for learning and action. But even if this happens, and if all funders continue to get more data from APIP and these other sources that show the disproportionately low amount of philanthropic funding that goes to AAPI communities, even if the recently formed Asian American Foundation, is successful at galvanizing long-term political and policy momentum by corporations and affluent leaders, those folks that reacted immediately to widespread violence against AAPI peoples, I still have a little bit of an unsettled feeling about whether AAPIs will really be fully seen, fully named, and fully accounted for in a serious and honest way. So, just wanted to say that I think this is a space, for me at least, where I'm feeling like we need to hold these tensions. We need to be super excited and grateful that philanthropy as a field is evolving, and we're making the time and space for these conversations. And I also feel like there's going to be a journey to continue to follow around real inclusion and sustained investment, and bringing about stronger relationships and really increased partnerships. So those are just some of the things that were on the top of my head for today. I appreciate the time and space to share those and set a little context as we start this. But super pleased at this point to turn over to two colleagues who are going to lead the session, Janelle Wong and Jonathan Tran. And I think you're going to get their bios and background links in the chat, so I won't do long intros, but these are folks that just have tremendous experience and deep knowledge, super attuned to the very interesting and evolving dynamics around AAPI communities and how they're situated to education issues and education politics. So big welcome to Janelle and Jonathan, and thank you for everything they're going to share today.
Thank you so much, Kenji, and thank you so much to GFE for hosting this session. My name is Janelle Wong, and I am a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland. And I also want to thank Paul Moon for having this, introducing me to this group several months ago with a real urgency around thinking about Asian Americans and education funding. So let's just start off. I'm here to provide some background and some context as you're thinking about grant making, education, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So next slide, please. And what I really want to emphasize here are connections between the past and the present. I think Kenji really put it well. There is a complexity and some tensions within our communities that we're going to explore today. But first, we're going to start off with a poll. Next slide, please. So no pressure on these polls. Just feel free to answer. It's anonymous. So you could see that there were a range of answers here. And the answer was B. You can see this gives you a sense of how the stereotypes of Asian Americans have changed over time. The answer was B, well adapted for clearing wildlands and their farming skills. In fact, a plan submitted to Congress in the late 1880s said no people were as good as well suited for clearing wildlands as the Chinese. Next slide, please. So we see these evolving stereotypes that began to justify Asian exclusion, especially in the mid to late 1800s, the era of Chinese exclusion. And one of the things that often gets lost in history is this kind of entanglement of stereotypes between especially Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, and Black Americans. And here you can see that the stereotypes were applied to Black Americans, and the charge of being degraded laborers was also applied to Chinese as a justification for exclusion. Next slide, please. Okay, so Asian Americans were also driven from many Western towns, and this also included a town in Washington State. So go ahead and take this. So the answer is that Asian Americans were, especially Filipino Americans, were seen as a threat to white women. You can see, hopefully in the slide that you see, I'm seeing a past slide that that one of the charges against Filipino Americans in Washington State was that they were seducing white women. And this was accompanied also by charges that they were a threat to the white workers in the area. Next slide, please. So you can see some diverging stereotypes across the different national origin groups. So there were also instances of lynching of Asian Americans. One of the largest mass lynchings in the United States was of Chinese men in Southern California, in Los Angeles, who were, one was accused of, I think, assaulting a cop or a police officer, and then there was this mass lynching. And this was really taking part, next slide, please, against the backdrop of racial violence against Black people. And so this shows you kind of both the kind of tied histories of people of color in the US, where lynching was a common form of racialized violence, but it also shows you a distinction. And that is in terms of the number of incidents, the magnitude of incidents, there were many, many, many fewer incidents of lynching against Asian Americans. In particular, there were, I would say, hundreds, maybe less than 200 lynchings related to Asian Americans. And there were more than 6,000 lynchings of Black people, not only in the South, but also in the North and some places in the North. And so this really gives you a sense of both the ways in which there are some common motivators of racialized violence having to do with white supremacy, but also there are differences in the way that different groups of color experience racialized violence in the US, especially in terms of magnitude. Next slide, please. So this is another, I'm going to ask you to do another poll here, and it has to do more with the topic of education. So the answer to this, next slide, please, is that yes, this is an important case. It was in the Superior Court of the state of California, and it did affirm that Mamie Tape, the Chinese child whose family sued the state because she was being excluded from an all-white school, that ruling did say that her civil rights were being violated. It was an equal protection claim, and she affirmed the 14th Amendment, saying that her equal protection claims had been violated. But at the same time, this case did not change the separate but equal doctrine. And so in the end, a new Chinese school was developed, and she ended up going to this segregated school. Okay, next slide, please. It's interesting to contrast that case, which took place in the 1880s, with another important case that took place in the 1920s, and that is Golem versus Rice. So this case actually went to the Supreme Court, and it reveals, I think, some of the tensions in Asian America from early settlements. So in Mississippi, a Chinese American family tried to send their girls to a white school, and they were there, and then they were banned from going there shortly after they had started on the basis of being designated as quote unquote colored. And they sued. And the way that this has been read in history is as a challenge to Jim Crow, and the way in which Jim Crow affected not only Black communities, but Asian communities too. At the same time, though, the Chinese family, and this is why the article here describes the case as troubling, the Chinese family also distanced from Black identity and Blackness, and their case revolved around the fact that they were fighting against being classified as Black. And so looking back at this case, we can see this kind of tension of trying to integrate really challenging unfair segregation laws, but also some questions over the racial identity of Asian Americans and their complicity here in some ways in not challenging the status quo, in actually reinforcing the racial status quo to some extent. And so it's also a troubling case in Asian American history and in education history. Okay, next slide, please. And these cases really, I think, show how many of the debates over race and the racial position of Asian Americans are not only complex, but very much rooted in the past. And so while we have heard so much about Asian American anti-Asian violence in the wake of the coronavirus, this is not new either. So this poignant cartoon also shows how at the very height of Chinese exclusion, Chinatowns were considered places of rampant disease, and as places where one of the justifications for the fact that Chinatowns were so segregated was the fact that people associated Chinese people and Chinese bodies with disease. And so that really came to the fore again after Donald Trump made comments about the China virus and the Wuhan virus. And so many felt this very deeply because these ideas are so rooted in history. This idea that not only are Asian Americans potential disease carriers, but that they are also fundamentally foreign. So next slide, please. And this idea of Asian Americans as being fundamentally foreign, as never being able to be fully American or belonging, has some echoes today. So today we see, this is from survey data that I collected with my colleagues 2 days after the shootings of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. And one of the questions we asked was, have you ever been encouraged to Americanize or whiten your name? And you can see here that Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans are among the most likely to have experienced this kind of microaggression. And of course, the idea of belonging is especially poignant for Pacific Islanders who were colonized by U.S. forces and by U.S. imperial force, basically. And so we see this kind of vestige of the past coming right to the current experiences of Asian Americans. Next slide, please. So this is very common, and when I even ask my students this, have people asked where you are from, assuming you're not from the US? This is one of the most kind of hallmark experiences of being Asian in the United States. So no matter how many years a person has lived in the United States, how many generations? So I myself am 6th generation in the US, still have been asked this question. And again, it's even more poignant for Pacific Islanders whose land has been taken, and people are asking if they are members of the territory that they originally occupied. So here we see that the idea of the forever foreigner is again coming into play in contemporary times. It is something that has always been with Asian Americans. So I'm going to ask to do the next poll. All right, it looks like most people have had a chance to answer. So let me go ahead and share the next screen. All right, and what you see here is that despite the fact that they face a lot of stereotypes, especially about being foreign, when it comes to education, sometimes another stereotype is evoked. And that is a stereotype many of you have heard of, the model minority stereotype. Asian Americans face some severe forms of discrimination, but they also are the least likely, at least in this survey, to say that a teacher has discouraged them from continuing their education. On the other hand, Pacific Islanders, who are under that AAPI umbrella, are among the most likely. Now, we did break this up by different national origin groups, and still those numbers tend to be lower. That doesn't mean there's not other kinds of discrimination that Asian American subgroups face. But as a whole, and even when we disaggregate these data, we don't see this particular form of institutionalized discrimination affecting Asian Americans as much as other groups. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons, so this does contribute in some ways, these kinds of data points and the model minority stereotype do contribute to this idea that Asian Americans face no discrimination in education. And I think it's worth just thinking about why Asian Americans are the most educated group in the United States as a whole. And because the model minority stereotype is so tenacious, people often attribute Asian American academic achievement to cultural values, like a cultural value for education and the idea that Asian American parents hold up education more than other groups do. And this has been widely debunked, and yet it still remains very powerful. So next slide, please. One of the reasons I find this stereotype so troubling is because it is way too simplistic. It ignores a lot of the structural factors that contribute to Asian American educational achievement. And so one of those factors is our immigration laws and selective recruitment. So what we see is that in the US, more than 50% of Chinese immigrants have a bachelor's degree. In China, the rate is about 8%. Where are Asian values more prevalent, China or the US? So this begins to get us thinking that maybe these ideas about culture are way too simplistic. They can also be dangerous because the assumption is that Asian Americans care more about education than any other group. And there's lots of research that shows that all groups care about education a great deal. But we see these same kinds of this kind of lazy thinking about educational achievement is very widespread. These statistics are actually a little old. So today, about 80% of Indian immigrants have a bachelor's degree in the US. In India, less than 15% of Indians of college age enroll in college. Again, where are Asian values more prevalent? The other problem with this stereotype is that it hides internal diversity. And this is something that you're going to be talking about more as in the next sessions. But let me just show you, next slide, please, the kind of variation that we're talking about. So this is, I think, also worth paying attention to and worth having a separate session on, which is that the model minority stereotype has been really problematic for race relations and for disciplining other racial groups against the Asian American experience and for not accounting for structural factors for educational achievement. But it also covers over these deep inequalities within Asian Americans. So you can see in this slide that for the most part, Southeast Asian Americans and Southeast Asian students, particularly those with refugee backgrounds from Cambodia, those who are Hmong or Lao people, have lower rates of college attainment than Black and Native Americans. And so this story often gets lost, and it gets lost among funders too. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to wrap up soon, but I wanted to do one more poll. And this is about Asian Americans' attitudes towards immigration. Towards education funding. Okay, so this is a hard question to answer. And if I hadn't done this survey, I would also be surprised. So this was a question asked in 2016, and we again disaggregated the data, which I think is really important. So you can see that overall, Asian Americans do support more federal support for college tuition, but you can also see that the groups that actually demonstrate the highest access to colleges and universities, that is Chinese and Indians, are not necessarily the most supportive of the federal government providing more support. In fact, it is those groups like Hmong, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis that have the least access that are most interested in these kinds of programs. And what does that show you? That yes, Asian Americans care about education, but access also matters a lot and will drive some of their thinking about policies related to education. Next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to share is these kind of patterns over a hot button issue in education, which is affirmative action. And so I can't emphasize enough that you cannot believe the headlines here. Most of the coverage of Asian Americans prior to the pandemic was about their opposition to affirmative action. But in fact, our data have shown for many years, Asian Americans have shown support for affirmative action. The one group that has shown a lot more variation are Chinese Americans. And Chinese Americans have actually become, those who oppose affirmative action have become a force against the policies in some ways. Still, Chinese Americans as a whole don't oppose affirmative action. So we're talking about a relatively small but highly mobilized group that has grabbed all the media attention in opposing affirmative action against a larger backdrop of widespread support for affirmative action. Next slide, please. So while Asian Americans do care about affirmative action and preserving it, there are also these really important places of activism within Asian America that I think funders also need to pay attention to, because these can pose a real threat to educational equity. And here I'm talking about public education, specialized high schools like Stuyvesant, where Asian American parents, not all, but some who are highly mobilized, have really come to attack the idea of admissions reforms to diversify and integrate those educational resources. Here you can see this really disturbing sign. Equity is a code word for anti-Asian. And I think it's worth all of us to consider this sentiment more and how we can combat it. Next slide, please. In addition, some groups, again, not all, but have become highly mobilized against how we teach race in public education. And here you see this headline that really gave me pause. All right, so I will end there and hope I've given you a lot of food for thought.
Am I jumping in here or we jump into the panel? I'm happy to jump in. So hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Tran. I'm a senior program manager at the California Endowment. I just want to say appreciations to GFE and also Janelle and Professor Wong, let's be clear, for her in-depth analysis about our community's journey. It's a privilege to be here with you all today and discussing and sharing about why and how the California Endowment has invested in API communities. As many of you may have heard, over the next 10 years, our foundation is committing $100 million to API communities that are focused on advancing racial equity and recognizing that API communities are a huge part of that fight and struggle for solidarity and equity for all communities. Just taking a quick step back, though, I want to take a moment just to recognize that the staff at the endowment felt like this is a watershed moment for our communities. And I say that because in a lot of ways, I affectionately describe myself as an ancient millennial. But more than anything else, I've been a product of movements of the past, right? So for example, the first internship I ever had was with the Asian American Legal Center in Los Angeles. And the executive director of APALC at the time, Stuart was a key leader in the legal advocacy for Vincent Chin, who was murdered in Detroit. I would not be here if organizations and foundations invested in the legal infrastructure of the API community in the aftermath of the murder of Vincent Chin. My first organizing job was with the Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance. Kiwa was established in the aftermath of the LA uprisings and the violence that broke out, but also the civil unrest and racial conflict that existed in Koreatown in South Central LA. And the investments that were made in those communities to invest in nonprofit organizations to bridge those gaps, to make it possible for communities to work together. I'm a byproduct of that. Heck, my first job after the working in the legislature was for a Southeast Asian American serving organization. That organization existed as a byproduct of foundations and government entities investing in the resettlement of refugee communities. So we understood that this moment for the API community was not just a moment, right? That we wanted to recognize that investment in API communities requires long-term investment, not just kind of like a rapid response emergency fund that's slapped together really quickly in the instance of responding to a crisis. So hopefully this conversation gives us an opportunity to dive deeper into the need to invest in API communities. I know there are a lot of folks on the call that are already doing that. And I think there's opportunities to figure out ways we can do it better, right? Diving into Janelle brought up a lot of data about how we can do a better job of really diving deep into the API subgroups and what their experiences are. There's a whole valley of need in terms of investments in the Pacific Islander community and how we need to be doing a better job as funders. So hopefully this conversation as we jump into the panel gives us an opportunity to do that. I will say that as we roll out kind of the grant making for over the next 10 years, I want to place an emphasis on the need for funders to kind of look at API communities in the lens of advancing a larger equity narrative when it comes particularly to education. The absence of doing anything and the lack of investment in API communities results in the polarization and what in the academic field is called the triangulation of the community that is oftentimes used against other communities of color. Here in California, beautiful blue state California, we've been the targets of very deliberate attempts to undermine equity as our priorities, right? We've seen it with Proposition 209 when the assault on affirmative action policies here in California. Overwhelmingly, Asian American communities voted against Proposition 209, but the reality was that from a narrative standpoint, it was a very, very easy talking point to direct Asian Americans against other communities of color. And then we saw it again in anti-immigration policy in Prop 187, right? The idea that some of us belong and some of us do not. And so I think it's important for funders just to recognize that the conversation of equity needs to be inclusive of API communities, because in the absence of it, our communities have been used to weaponized against other communities of color. So with that, I think it'd be great just to open up and pass back to Kenji as we dive deep into the panel discussion itself.
So a ton of information there and a lot to think about. I'm curious if folks have been reflecting, trying to digest, offering any thoughts, comments, questions in the chat. We can certainly use that as a potential venue and way to, to see what's on folks' minds, if there's anything that would be useful for us to respond to right now.
I mean, I think most importantly, Kenji, yeah, I guess I see these comments coming in. It's really, how does this relate to funding decisions and what's the urgency here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, I guess I'll just pick up from what Jonathan was offering in particular and say that, I think that there's a number of things for education funders to consider that sort of span, if I think about this putting on more of a traditional education funder's hat, whether you're interested in early learning, whether you're interested in K-12 issues, whether you're interested in higher education issues. You know, undoubtedly, Asian American and Pacific Islander communities are having very particular experiences around any of those segments of education. And so I do feel like there's clear opportunities for funders, even in your current set of priorities right now, to be examining where are Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. You know, I think as Jonathan named that, you know, there are, I think, a whole set of broad access and success issues around education that can and should be, you know, supported with Asian Americans being thought of and included in a way that's sort of about, you know, connecting not just what makes sense for other subgroups, but also back to Asian American Pacific Islanders. I can take one quick example, which is that our foundation has been some supporting research, you know, coming out of UCLA, looking, for example, at what's going on really specifically with Black students. And that is critical research, and there needs to be that examination. And we are trying to also do that in relationship to, you know, other researchers that are looking at issues, for example, around English learners. In California, a lot of our English learner populations are, you know, Latinx and AAPI communities. And so there's a way in which we're trying to think about and build an evidence and a set of ideas to then feed into what Jonathan was saying about narrative that really ensure that we're trying to be thoughtful and connecting around how these different analyses and different efforts to do improvement in schools are really working for all students and not in a way that is necessarily you know, working for some students at the exclusion or the detriment of others. So I think any of those kinds of opportunities would be ones that I would encourage education funders to think about right now, and that you know, not to move into a quicksand topic, but I think in many school districts right now, issues around equity, issues around critical race theory, issues around you know, ethnic studies, any of those things are also going to be creating a context and environment that is difficult for funders to navigate and difficult for those who have been supporting instructional improvement or increased access or any of those other things that we as education funders are interested in for any population. All of those things are also going to be harder to do right now. And so again, I feel like the engagement and awareness with AAPI leaders and communities around education issues is really to the benefit of funders to continue to just get that information and think about how to situate the education priorities that we have in this you know, very dynamic context.
There's some other questions that have come up that I think are really important here. One is, you know, what is the funding strategy around Pacific Islanders in particular, and how do we need to build that? The second, I think, is another really important question, which is who is funding narrative change and framing around public funding, especially as these narratives, you know, these false narratives about racial integration in public specialized high schools and magnet programs. Who's funding the narrative that challenges the idea that those reforms hurt Asian Americans? Jonathan, do you know anyone who's doing that? Or Kenji, do you know anyone?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of the broader narrative change to like funding ecosystem, in particular, education funding is really, it's been a grind. It's been a struggle in terms of like trying to identify funders that are prioritizing narrative and communications. I do like to point out like that in the image that you shared, Janelle, like that was a reporter holding up that equity is an anti-Asian term, right? That like the reality of ethnic media, particularly that is influencing public discourse and then the sentiments of public investments within our own communities has been disinvested in for a really long time, right? Like ethnic media has struggled significantly, particularly within the API languages. And so it's created an opportunity for folks that have additional resources to really buy out a lot of the ethnic media outlets and resources. And in doing so, being able to project disinformation, false information, antagonistic information directly to communities. So you can almost have like a direct line between the disappearance of neutral ethnic media outlets and the infrastructure for ethnic media, and also the alignment with the increase in sentiments against educational equity, right? So one of the areas that we're looking at investing in is how do you support organizations that are working in concert with ethnic media outlets so that they're working in concert with each other to develop the right messages that go to communities. The other side is like trying to figure out where the delivery methods are. How are these messages getting to parents and families, right? I think education funders on this call are probably dealing with parent groups and that are passing around disinformation about vaccinations and critical race theory. How do those news stories and that narrative take shape and take hold? And we're studying those outlets within the API community. So in particular, WeChat, WhatsApp, all of these smaller internal social networks is usually the source of how a lot of this disinformation is spread about within our communities. And so so there's a bunch of layers if folks are interested in funding for narrative change in the infrastructure. So one, you can fund the infrastructure, right? The delivery methods, support ethnic media as part of any of your communication strategies so that they don't have to rely on these outside sources for the revenue. You can support community-based organizations so they have the tools to be able to articulate their own narratives, help their communities tell their stories. And the last piece, I think, is a research and analytics to give us a better understanding of like how information is being delivered to our communities. All those things, I think, contribute to the narrative ecosystem. I think the hardest thing for us when we were embarking on it was like, where on earth do we start? So I would recommend like sitting down with a community-based organization and having that conversation with them to see where their needs are.
And anyone want to take a stab at Pacific Islander, efforts to truly engage with and target Pacific Islander students? I mean, this has been a need and remains a need.
I mean, if it was, super easy, we would have done it, right? So I want to acknowledge that. I do think that this is a very clear case again, and you had set this up so well in the slides around this issue of disaggregated data and just our own mindsets. So I think too, it's critical that we keep in mind the orientation to disaggregation and to thinking in these ways that is clear and specific about different groups. For Pacific Islanders in particular, I think that data question is a really important one. And again, even within Pacific Islander communities, there are different realities for Native Hawaiians versus Tongans or Samoans, et cetera. So I do think that the first recommendation would be, do everything possible to try and get disaggregated data. Think about, again, if you're an education funder, whether there's publicly available data from, state or local districts that has disaggregation, can you push for that? Are there potential research partners, professors, scholars, universities that can help do some of that work in particular? The other thing that I would say about, the opportunity to engage and think about Pacific Islander communities is, the silos that we sit in as education funders, kind of thinking about education as a particular issue in a particular domain, sometimes are not helpful. And so, in many cases, not just for Pacific Islander communities, for many other communities, their lived experience and their day-to-day realities, put them in a relationship with trusted organizations in their community that are organizations that do many different kinds of things. These can be faith-based organizations. Folks have faith communities that are critical for their support and resource. These can be, organizations that are what you would sort of think of as like a community resource center type organization that do all kinds of things, right? Jobs, housing, all sorts of. And so, that would be one of the other ways that I would think of encouraging education funders to kind of just dig a little bit deeper, and thinking about how to get into those relationships with folks that are really connected to and are themselves leading a lot of efforts in Pacific Islander communities. Aside from that, there are, of course, a set of specific and dedicated Pacific Islander organizations doing work across multiple states and nationally. Many of those organizations, I think, similar to other Asian American nonprofits, are virtually starved for private philanthropic resource. And so the last thing I would say is, if you can get access or data to understanding where government funding is flowing, whether that's city or county funding, whether it's state funding, I would do a quick peek and try and figure out if there are Pacific Islander communities that are community-based organizations that are running largely on government money and serving their communities, but haven't been seen and funded by philanthropy.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I would ditto everything Kenji just described. One of the lessons that we had to learn the hard way was the notion that you can fund the Pan-Asian or API organization and assume that those funds will trickle down to local organizations, right? Like, I love my Pan-Asian organizations. The bigger ones hold the fort down. But the reality with PI organizations is that we have to get away from being afraid of funding smaller organizations. Maybe they don't have that same track record as some of the other established API organizations, but the reality is that the infrastructure for the community is still growing, still developing. If we don't start small and start somewhere, then those organizations aren't able to have the capacity infrastructure to grow and advance. So I would discourage the trickle down from a large API org and just assume they're going to cover PI folks, even if they write it into the grant. We got scolded for that as the endowment, right? Like, we were told by Pacific Islander organizations that that doesn't work. The small, tiny subgrants that they get from those types of grants is not sufficient to help them run their organization. So the lesson for us was that if you're going to invest in PI communities, go directly to the PI communities and make, even if it's the small grants with them, and support the small organizations, because that adds to cumulative effect.
We did have one additional question that I'll point out here before we invite people to the Jam board. Just somebody asked, Valley Varo had asked, outside of California, AAPI funders and foundations and maybe a few major donors in New York, I don't hear or know about too many other education funders who are prioritizing AAPI students in their giving. Am I missing something? There's specific folks you might direct them to?
One, I'll just own that I'm in California. So two, I would say that I think, I think that could be a fair observation or assessment. I do want to acknowledge that I think that there are AAPI communities that probably on a local level have different relationships and visibility around their community foundations or around other kinds of philanthropic infrastructure. So I'm thinking particularly of, communities in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, for example. I'm thinking of AAPI communities in Texas, Louisiana. I'm thinking, unfortunately, given the circumstances, there's a lot more attention being paid to AAPI communities in Georgia. Like, there are places where AAPI communities have been growing. I think the recent census numbers, if anybody has seen those, are really interesting. To look at overall growth of AAPI communities and the dispersion and geographic location of where AAPI communities are increasing. And so, I cannot think of specific education funders that are really trying to look specifically at our communities. I mean, hence wanting to stimulate this conversation today. But I do think that there are probably some places that we can look across the country to maybe have a funder to funder conversation. Especially if we look at community foundations or we look at some other regional foundations and say, hey, what have you all been doing with your education funding? How are you seeing AAPI students and AAPI families and communities, show up in how schools are being operated? Are you hearing a lot from AAPI community organizations as you try and do regional or place-based education investing work? in some of these communities. So off the top of my head, again, given that I am in California and that we have the density here, that would be one of the tacks that I would take if I was kind of scouring elsewhere.
All right, well, thank you. I want to thank Janelle and Jonathan and Kenji for a great conversation. We have put in the chat a Jamboard. There are a couple of other sessions coming up in this series, specifically focusing on API communities. And we'd love to get your thoughts on topics, questions that you'd like to see addressed specifically. So there is a link to a Jamboard. I know for those of you who are watching the recording, we will try and put the link there for you as well. But before we close out, just want to say thank you again, and also share, Jesse, if we could put up the slide. Grantmakers for Education does have a few upcoming programs. Critical race theory was brought up in this conversation about kind of a place where there are folks kind of putting wedges between communities. So we do have our second series on equity, polarization, and critical race theory, how funders can bring a thoughtful approach to the debate. That's coming up on September 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then of course we have our GFE 2021 annual conference. So thank you again for joining us. Please, for those of you who are on live, please click on the Jamboard and leave some thoughts for us. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon.